Thank you so much, Aria. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody. Wonderful to see so many people, and thank you for participating in this series of seminars. Now, my pleasure to be able to just kick off the discussion today about the two-state solution, and I want to just share really some ideas and give a little bit of a historical context to the current discussion. It seems to have become kind of mainstream, a self-evident paradigm, as it were, that, this conflict must result in the creation of a Palestinian state. And we're living in a world of short sound bites and of very quick impressions. And many of us don't have much of a sense of where all of this came from. And it's remarkable that I don't think there's any other country in the world where there's such an intense and ongoing discussion and so many UN resolutions dealing with the creation of a state. And I think Einat and Kobe will speak very well to the fact that this Palestinian state is problematic, to say the least, in so many ways. So I'm going to share a few slides with you. I hope this this works. And really what I'd like to do is just go with you to think about where the idea of two states came from. Now, the idea of a state, of course, is a combination between a people and a territory. No state is perfect, and I think every state comes into existence one way or another through the use of force. There would be, I think, no state in the world where the existence of the state and the territories of the state have not been created as a result of some kind of conflict or use of force. So it's important, I think, to realize no state is perfect. And secondly, every state, while it may represent or reflect the existence of a particular nation or people, is normally populated by many different nations or peoples or ethnic groups. So there's nothing unique about states, both having national identity, but also consisting of many ethnic, national, or religious minorities. And so in that respect, Israel is no different from any other states. My other point, just by way of introduction, is to say that from an international law perspective, all of these concepts are very fluid and very much subject to discussion. The concept of peoplehood, the concept of a nation, the concept of territory, and even the concept of a state are highly contentious. And we saw that in the current proceedings before the International Criminal Court. There's a lot of discussion out there about what actually do we mean by a state. There is no fixed absolute international law definition. We have the Montevideo criteria, but they're not absolutely binding in every situation. And in reality, states are recognized, it seems, more and more on the basis of political considerations than legal ones. My final point by way of introduction is to say that this idea of two states, in the case of Palestine, two states for two peoples, is not an idea which came from the peoples themselves. This is a foreign construct, as we'll see in a moment, that has been developed over the last 100 years. It's always come from Europe or from the international institutions. It does not come from the Palestinians themselves and doesn't come from Israel itself. This is an attempt by others to solve what they perceive to be the problem. And I think one of the things we will discuss is that we perhaps don't understand necessarily what the problem is, let alone identifying the right solution. So if we take a step back in time here, you'll see my first slide about the expulsion of Jews in Europe over the 400-500 years of the Middle Ages, simply by way of illustration of, in a way, the uniqueness of the Jewish people, a people whose identity was very much connected with a particular territory, but for whose most of its existence has lived in a diaspora, moving from territory to territory and never being anywhere at home. And I think, as we saw last week, the idea of a return of Zionism as a return to the land is very much core to Jewish Zionist identity and to the identity of the state of Israel today. If we think about Palestine, and we're going to think about the idea of what is Palestine and how do we divide it, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire for 400 years. And here we see a map of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, in which Palestine, on the eastern border of the Mediterranean, was not a defined entity as we've come to know it, but was part of really the region that was governed from Damascus. And Jerusalem was not the capital of a region, but was really an outlying part of a broader region of Syria. And it wasn't until really the beginning of the 20th century that the physical determination of Palestine became an issue with the Balfour Declaration and the creation of the Mandate for Palestine. Now, the Mandate for Palestine, which we talked about last week, but I want to re-emphasize it today, was born out of the League of Nations Covenant. And this idea of self-determination for peoples. The discussion today that we see in the ICC, but also in other institutions like the Court of Justice and certainly within the UN, is that the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine was somehow an injustice because it did not reflect the idea of giving self-determination to the peoples existing in the territories of the empires where the mandates were created. And of course, the unique thing about Palestine was the fact that the Jewish people at that time, we're talking 1920, immediately after the First World War, the Jewish people were in the minority, very much so. And the idea of the Jewish homeland was to enable the Jewish people to return to Palestine to create the national home for the Jewish people. So it was a unique idea that today by many is regarded as being in breach of the covenant itself. And this underlies for many the idea of the two-state solution. I'll come back to that. As we saw again last week, 3 mandates were created. And here we see really the beginnings of a territorial settlement or a territorial solution for the Middle East. And Syria today and Iraq today and Lebanon and Jordan, their borders were created exactly the same time as Palestine. That is, by the mandates for the former Ottoman Turkish territories. But all of those areas comprise many different nationalities and people groups, ethnic people groups, as well as, of course, religious minorities. But we don't dispute their boundaries, the territories of these states as such, at least not from an international law perspective. And yet there is a constant discussion about the territories of the state of Israel that came out of the Mandate for Palestine. Now, the idea of two states in Palestine, there's nothing new about this. In fact, it's been on the table ever since the creation of the Mandate for Palestine. And the first two-state solution really was the creation of Transjordan out of the Mandate for Palestine. Now, there's an argument about whether or not Transjordan was part of the Mandate territory or not. I think that it was. But in any event, clearly the concept of Palestine extended beyond the Jordan River, and Transjordan was created by the British to appease the Arabs at the time and to enable the Hashemites to be put in place by the British as kind of puppets, really, of the British foreign policy, and to enable Britain also to control Transjordan. But here we have a territorial solution to resolve what was seen to be a conflict between two people groups, the Jews and the Arab Palestinians. And from that moment on, there have been many different two-state solutions over the course of the last 100 years. And as I said before, all of them are imposed solutions. Okay, it has never been the case that the initiative has come from the Jewish people or from the Arab Palestinians themselves to create two states living side by side. And the question is whether or not that concept has any legitimacy from a political but also from a legal point of view. Certainly none of the solutions that have been presented has ever been successful and has ever been embraced by both sides. This is the Peel Commission in 1936, and the British, during the Mandate period, in response to the Arab uprising of 1936, despite their promises to enable the Jewish homeland to exist in Palestine. And by the way, the Mandate for Palestine never envisaged a division into two states. It might be said in retrospect that the Mandate did not exclude that possibility, but it was never envisaged as part of the Mandate. Although the Mandate spoke only of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, it was clearly intended that the Jewish national home would cover almost all, or if not all, of Palestine, and certainly the area west of the Jordan River, now known as the West Bank, known as Judea and Samaria to the Jewish people, the biblical heartland of Palestine. And we can recall that the Mandate territory was based on the principle of Dan to Beersheba, which Lloyd George introduced in San Remo. The biblical concept of the Jewish homeland from the north of Dan in the Golan Heights down to Beersheba in the Negev. And so clearly this would have included Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem. Nevertheless, the British, in their wisdom, thought that the Jews could get a tiny little sliver of a homeland in the northwest. That proposal never went anywhere. The next proposal that we saw was the partition plan of the United Nations in November 1947. We're approaching the anniversary of partition plan, and again we'll see UN resolutions passed to recall that UN resolution as if it had some legal significance, which it doesn't. The partition plan was never adopted. It was rejected by the Arabs in the first instance, and it's never been implemented. But this is a model which still persists in the mind of many diplomats. And the idea of the internationalization of Jerusalem as part of that plan, I think, persists in the mindset of many. Nevertheless, from a legal perspective, this was a two-state solution that never was adopted. Bernadotte, the UN negotiator, proposed a couple of two-state solutions. This is one of them. And again, the Jews would have that little blue segment. It's reminiscent of the British Peel Plan of 36. Again, that plan, those plans by Bernadotte were never accepted, and it cost him his life. Bernadotte was assassinated in 1948, I recall, I think. And so then we had the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948, and the borders, the boundaries of Israel were at that point still undetermined in many ways because of the context of conflict and the Arab invasion of Israel. So Israel had very little opportunity to establish its own borders, and it only did so in response to that invasion. And this is the armistice lines, and this is in fact a map of what the EU today would like to see as being a two-state solution. It's the result of an aggressive war, an aggressive Arab war against the State of Israel. And I think one of the key objections or problems with the EU solution is it's based on a historical injustice. In fact, it's based on the first fundamental major breach of the UN Charter, which was the Arab attack of the State of Israel. And from that respect, I think it has very little legitimacy. The so-called 1967 borders, which are the 1949 armistice lines, are the result of a war in which the Jewish people were fighting for their existence. We had the aggression over the next 20 years leading up to the Six-Day War, and of course, Israel taking control of territories in the Six-Day War. And since then, we've had a whole raft of two-state solutions. And Aryeh, I'll start drawing to a conclusion here. But just very briefly to show you some of these solutions, this is what the territory looked like after the Egypt Camp David peace negotiations in 1979, 1980, which opened up the pathway to discussions with the Palestinians. The peace treaty with Egypt did not define a two-state solution. It simply envisaged negotiations with the Palestinians. We've had the EU two-state solution since 1980, which has grown over that period of time, which is basically an implementation of the status quo after the after the 1949 War of Independence. They would like to see a state in which Palestine exists in the whole of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, with East Jerusalem as its capital. That is the EU position. And they impose that position by way of what they call parameters on the negotiations. It's another story. We're in fact producing a report at the moment we hope to publish shortly about the legal implications of that policy. The Oslo Accords did not envisage a two-state solution. It envisaged Palestinian independence, but it doesn't talk about statehood. The Oslo Accords do not require a Palestinian state to come into existence. And one of the problems of the modern two-state solution is that it in fact contradicts the Oslo Accords, which is a binding treaty between Israel and the PLO, or at least a binding agreement, binds the PLO, and the PA was created under the Oslo agreements. Nevertheless, many insist that a Palestinian state is created. This is what was proposed in 2000 in Camp David at the negotiations presided over by President Clinton between Prime Minister Barak and Yasser Arafat. It was rejected by the PLO. I think there's a fairly wide consensus that it was Arafat who walked away from that deal. The Palestinians could have had a state consisting of most of the West Bank. And as I said, Clinton, in his memoirs, said it was Arafat who walked away from that proposal. Dennis Ross said the same thing, and the Saudis have said the same thing as well. We had another proposal in 2008. This is Olmert's offer to Abbas, which Abbas never replied to. We've had the Trump peace plan, peace to prosperity plan, which again is rejected by Palestinians and the Arab world generally. So we've had a whole raft of proposals, and this is the Palestinians' proposal. From their perspective, everything is a concession. Their right is to the whole of Palestine. This is the official position of the PLO still today, that Palestine covers the whole of Mandate Palestine. So even the existence of the State of Israel would be a concession from their perspective. So there are many sticking points. We won't go into them today. There are many legal issues, but at the same time as the negotiations, we have the Palestinians using the UN system to create a virtual state of Palestine, which is basically what we see happening in the UN over a series of resolutions over the years and decisions by international courts. This entity called Palestine has come into existence, and nobody knows if it's a state or not. And there's very little common ground on these issues. Nevertheless, the Palestinians in the world are treating Palestine as if it were a state. I don't have time to go into the international law issues. There are many of them. But basically, there are two ways of looking at it. You can look at it as if Israel did not exist, or you can look at it assuming Israel does exist. And I think from a legal perspective, the starting point must be the existence of the State of Israel as a legitimate state under international law. And any entity that is created cannot be allowed, cannot interfere and undermine the sovereignty of an existing UN state. The other perspective is to say, no, it's all about the creation of a state of Palestine. That is the priority, because for some reason, the creation of the State of Israel was an injustice. It was a breach of the Palestinian right to self-determination. So I'll conclude by simply saying that I think any solution must respect Israel's sovereignty, its security, and territorial integrity. There can be no support for any PLO or the PA unless they abandon their plans to annihilate Israel, which is still part of the Palestinian Charter. We have to start exploring other possibilities for Palestinian autonomy rather than statehood, and abandon plans to redivide Jerusalem, and finally reform the UNRWA UN refugee system. And I'm sure that's a nice introduction to the next presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.